You have probably seen it by now, even if you did not know what you were looking at. A group of grown men or an entire stadium of fans suddenly sitting back and pulling their arms toward their chests in unison, again and again, as if heaving on invisible oars. A low chant rising with the motion. Thousands of people moving together like the crew of a single ship. In the summer of 2026, this strange and hypnotic gesture spread across the football world like wildfire, filmed in stadiums, copied in city squares, shared millions of times on every screen on Earth. They call it the Viking Row. It began with the fans and players of Norway, who returned to the World Cup in 2026 after an absence of 28 years, and it became, almost overnight, one of the most talked about celebrations in the history of the modern game. Star players did it. Crowds did it in the streets. In Norway itself, tens of thousands of people rowing together were said to have registered as a tremor on seismographs. But not everyone loved it. As with anything that becomes wildly popular very fast, a backlash followed close behind. Some rival fans found it arrogant, a way of rubbing a victory in the faces of the defeated. Some commentators called it overhyped, a manufactured piece of marketing dressed up as ancient tradition. Others simply grew tired of seeing it everywhere, in every advertisement, on every highlight reel, until a gesture that had felt fresh began, to some, to feel forced. Loved by millions, mocked by many. The Viking Row became one of those things people argued about as much as they enjoyed. And yet, beneath the noise and the memes and the arguments, almost no one stopped to ask the real question. Where did this actually come from? Why a boat? Why rowing? Why, of all the images a nation could choose to represent its strength and unity, did Norway reach back to the picture of men pulling together on the oars of a ship? The answer is far older, far darker, and far more terrifying than any celebration. Because for 3 centuries, across the coasts of Europe, the sight of those boats, long, low, and impossibly fast, appearing on the horizon at dawn, did not mean joy. It meant that death had come. This is the true history behind the gesture now sweeping the world. This is the story of the Vikings. The man who invented it never expected any of this. He was not a marketing executive or a football official. He was a primary school teacher from Norway named Ole Frøystad, an ordinary fan who wanted his country's supporters to have something of their own. A signature, an identity, the way Iceland's fans had once made their thunderclap famous across the world. He worked on the idea in 2025, and when Norway qualified for the World Cup, after nearly 3 decades of waiting, he brought it to the stands. A drumbeat, a shouted word. Row, the Norwegian word for row, and thousands of bodies pulling together on oars that were not there. It was first tried at a friendly match in the spring of 2026, and by the time the tournament began, it had taken on a life of its own. Within weeks, it had escaped the stadium entirely. People performed it in city squares and train stations. Videos of it gathered millions upon millions of views. When Norway won matches, entire cities seemed to rock back and forth in unison, and the movement of so many bodies at once was reportedly picked up by earthquake sensors. Even the country's royal family was seen joining in. For a small nation returning to the world's biggest sporting stage after so long away, it was more than a celebration. It was a statement: we are here, and we move as one. That is the strange power of the gesture. Most of the millions who copied it, in stadiums and schoolyards across the world, knew nothing of its deeper roots. They saw only joy, rhythm, and the thrill of belonging to something. But symbols have long memories, even when we do not. And this particular symbol, the crew, the oars, the single body of many people moving as one, reaches back through 12 centuries of history to a time when it was not performed for cameras, but for survival. To understand it fully is to understand one of the most feared, most misunderstood, and most influential peoples ever to sail the seas. To understand why those boats meant death, we must travel back more than 1,200 years to the cold coasts of Scandinavia, the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. In the late 8th century, this was a world almost entirely unknown to the rest of Europe. It was a harsh and beautiful place of deep fjords, dark forests, and long winters where the sun barely rose for months at a time. The people who lived there were farmers, fishermen, and traders. They were not a single nation or a unified kingdom. They were scattered communities ruled by chieftains, bound together by a shared language, a shared way of life, and a shared belief in a pantheon of powerful gods. Odin, Thor, Freya, and the rest. Life in these northern lands was hard. The soil was thin and rocky, the growing season short. As the population grew, there was simply not enough good farmland to go around, especially for the younger sons of chieftains who stood to inherit little. These were proud, ambitious young men raised on stories of glory in a culture that prized courage in battle above almost anything else. They believed that to die fighting was the highest honor a man could achieve, a path to a glorious afterlife in the hall of the slain. And they were superb craftsmen with one particular skill that would change the history of the world. They could build ships unlike any others on Earth. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was their single greatest weapon. It was long and narrow, with a shallow draft that allowed it to glide through water only a few feet deep. This meant the Vikings could do something no one else could. They did not need harbors. They could sail straight up rivers, deep into the heart of a country, and they could run their ships right onto a beach, leap out and attack before anyone even knew they were there. The ships were powered by both sail and oar, and when the wind failed, the warriors themselves would pull on those oars in perfect, disciplined unison, driving the vessel forward with astonishing speed. That rowing was not a game. It was the sound of an approaching nightmare. For the people of Europe, who had no warning system, no coastal defenses prepared for such an enemy, and no way to predict where the next strike would fall, the Vikings were the perfect predator. They came from the sea, struck without warning, and vanished back into the water before any army could be gathered against them. And the first time the wider world truly understood what had arrived on its shores, it happened at a quiet, holy place off the coast of England. It is important, before we go further, to understand what the word Viking actually means, because it did not describe a nation or a people, and most Scandinavians of that era never went raiding at all. To go Viking was closer to a job description. It meant to go on an expedition, to set out over the sea in search of wealth, whether by trade or by plunder. The vast majority of the men and women of the North lived and died as farmers, herders, fishermen, weavers, and craftspeople, people whose lives revolved around the seasons and the sea, and who never once lifted an axe against a foreign shore. The raiders were a minority, bold, dangerous, and unforgettable, but a minority all the same. History remembers the warriors because the people they attacked wrote the records, and terror leaves a deeper mark on parchment than peace ever does. That is worth keeping in mind through everything that follows. The story of the Viking Age was written, almost entirely, by the people on the receiving end of it. Their world was also bound together by belief. The Norse imagined a cosmos of 9 realms held in the branches of a great world tree, where gods and giants waged an endless struggle that would one day end in Ragnarok, the doom of the gods themselves. A warrior who died bravely in battle, they believed, might be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, the golden hall of Odin, there to feast and fight until the end of the world. Whether every raider truly believed this, no one can say. But it was a faith that made courage sacred and death in battle, not a tragedy to be feared, but a destiny to be embraced. And that belief, carried in the hearts of young men in fast ships, would prove to be one of the most dangerous forces in all of European history. And what of the women of this world? Here, too, the reality is more interesting than the legend. Norse women held rights that were unusual for their age. They could own property, demand divorce, and manage farms and fortunes while their husbands were at sea, which, in a seafaring society, meant they ran a great deal of daily life. Some traveled on the great voyages of settlement to Iceland and Greenland, building new lives at the edge of the known world. The sagas remember formidable matriarchs, sharp-tongued and iron-willed, whose decisions steered the fates of entire families. Archaeologists continue to debate how many women may have fought or led. The famous warrior graves raise questions that scholars still argue over. But what is beyond doubt is that the world of the Norse was not built by men alone, and its women were far from silent passengers in it. One more force was pushing those ships onto the water, and it is easy to overlook: silver. To the south and east of Scandinavia, lay worlds of almost unimaginable wealth. The treasuries of Frankish kings, the markets of the Islamic Caliphate, the golden churches of Byzantium. Traders returning north brought tales of it and coins as proof. For a young man on a rocky farm at the edge of the world, the sea was not a barrier. It was a road, the only road, to wealth, reputation, and a name that would outlive him. Some would earn it honestly, hauling furs and amber to distant markets. Others would take a shorter path. Very often, they were the same men in different seasons, a trader where the towns were strong, a raider where they were weak. The line between commerce and plunder in that world was exactly as thick as the defences of the coast in question. The date was the 8th of June in the year 793. On the small island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England, stood a monastery, one of the most sacred and revered centres of Christian learning in all of the British Isles. It was a place of peace, of prayer, of quiet monks copying beautiful manuscripts by candlelight. It was undefended, wealthy with religious treasures, and utterly unprepared for what came out of the sea that day. The Norse raiders fell upon Lindisfarne with a savagery that shocked the entire Christian world. They plundered the church of its treasures. They cut down monks where they stood, drowned others in the sea, and carried many away in chains to be sold as slaves. The news of it spread across Europe like a scream. A scholar of the age, writing in horror, lamented that never before had such terror appeared in Britain, that no one had thought such a voyage of raiders from the sea was even possible. The attack on Lindisfarne is remembered as the event that opened the Viking Age. For the next 300 years, the coasts and rivers of Europe would live in fear of the dragon-headed ships. What followed was not a single war, but 3 centuries of raiding, conquest, and terror that reached almost unbelievable distances. The Vikings were not confined to England. They sailed their longships up the rivers of France and laid siege to Paris itself. They raided the coasts of Spain and pushed into the Mediterranean. They traveled east through the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, trading and raiding all the way to the walls of Constantinople, the greatest city of the Christian East. Some of them served as elite bodyguards to the emperor there. The reach of these northern seafarers was simply staggering for their time. And it was not only raiding. In many places, the Vikings came to stay. They carved out a huge territory in the north and east of England that came to be governed by Norse law. They settled in northern France, in a region that still bears their name to this day, Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and their descendants would go on to conquer England themselves in 1066. They were more than raiders. They were conquerors, settlers, and kings, reshaping the map of Europe as they went. Try to imagine what a raid felt like from the other side, because this is the heart of why those ships meant death. You are a farmer, or a fisherman, or a monk living in a small settlement near the coast. There are no watchtowers, no signal fires, no standing army within 100 miles. One morning, at first light, someone notices shapes on the horizon, low, fast, and coming straight for the shore. There is no time to gather men, no time to hide the livestock, barely time to run. The ships do not slow at the shallows. They drive straight up onto the sand, and armed men are leaping out of them before the keels have even stopped moving. What happens next takes less than an hour. When it is over, everything of value is gone, buildings are burning, and some of the people you knew are dead or being led in ropes toward the ships. By the time word reaches the nearest lord and soldiers are gathered, the sea is empty. The raiders are simply gone, as if the ocean itself had attacked and withdrawn. That was the terror of it. Not only the violence, but the helplessness. Kingdoms that could raise great armies were powerless against an enemy who refused to stand and fight them, who struck only where the defenses were not, and who could appear anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline and riverbank. Chroniclers of the age wrote with a kind of despair. And in some churches, it was said, people began to pray for deliverance from the fury of the Northmen. For communities along the coasts, every clear morning carried a question no one could answer. Is today the day the ships come? The slave trade deserves honest mention here, because it is a part of the story that later romantic images of the Vikings often leave out. Human beings were among the most valuable cargo a longship could carry. Men, Women and children seized in raids across Ireland, Britain, and the Baltic lands were carried to markets and sold, some ending up thousands of miles from home. This traffic in human lives was not a side effect of the Viking Age. It was one of its engines, a source of the silver that enriched the North. It is a hard truth, and history is not served by softening it. The same ships that carried explorers to new worlds carried captives away from their own. The great rivers of Europe became their highways, and the scale of what they attempted grew with each generation. In the year 845, a massive fleet sailed up the Seine to Paris itself, and the Frankish king, unable to drive them off, paid an enormous ransom in silver to make them leave. A payment that taught the raiders a lesson they would never forget. The kingdoms of Europe would pay for peace. Again and again, rulers in England and France handed over staggering sums, tribute that came to be known in England as Danegeld, the Danes' gold. It bought quiet for a season, and it guaranteed the ships would return. In 885, the Northmen came back to Paris with one of the largest fleets ever assembled and besieged the city for the better part of a year. And in England, what began as raids became full invasion. In 865, a force the frightened chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed not to plunder and leave, but to conquer and stay. Within a decade, 3 of the 4 great English kingdoms had fallen to it, and only one. Wessex, under a young king named Alfred, held out, fighting the invaders to a standstill and saving the idea of England itself. The East tells an equally astonishing story, though it is far less known. Norse traders and adventurers, mostly from what is now Sweden, pushed down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, dragging their ships overland between waterways, trading furs, amber, and slaves for Arab silver. The local Slavic peoples called some of these newcomers the Rus, and the states that grew around their trading strongholds at Novgorod and Kiev would, over centuries, give their name to something far larger, Russia itself. Norse warriors traveled so far south that they reached Constantinople, the golden capital of the Byzantine Empire, which they called simply the Great City. Unable to conquer it, they did something almost more remarkable. They joined it. The emperors of Byzantium came to trust these fearsome northerners so completely that they formed them into their personal bodyguard, the famous Varangian Guard. And for generations, young men from the fjords of Scandinavia served and grew rich in the marble halls of the greatest city in the Christian world. Ireland suffered as grievously as anywhere, and its story shows the other face of the raiders, the builders. Norse fleets hammered the Irish coasts and rich monasteries for generations, and the raiders who came to plunder stayed to trade. The fortified camps they planted at river mouths grew into something Ireland had never had before, true towns. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick. The oldest cities of Ireland began as Viking harbours, and Dublin in particular grew into one of the great trading hubs of the northern world, its wealth built, in bitter part, on the trade in human beings. It is one of history's uncomfortable ironies that the island's proudest cities were founded by the very seafarers its monks had prayed to be delivered from. But to see the Vikings only as bloodthirsty raiders would be to badly misunderstand them, and to miss the most fascinating part of their story. Because the same people who terrified the monks of Lindisfarne were also among the greatest explorers, traders, and craftsmen the world had ever seen. The truth of who they were is far richer and stranger than the simple image of the axe-wielding barbarian. Consider their voyages of exploration, which were centuries ahead of their time. Viking seafarers pushed out into the empty, storm-racked expanse of the North Atlantic in open wooden boats, navigating by the sun and the stars. They discovered and settled Iceland. They pushed on to the harsh coasts of Greenland and founded colonies there. And then, around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus was even born, a Norse expedition led by Leif Erikson reached the shores of North America itself. At a place in modern-day Newfoundland, archaeologists have found the remains of a genuine Viking settlement, proof that these northern seafarers had crossed an entire ocean and set foot in the Americas half a millennium before the rest of Europe had any idea the continent existed. They were also sophisticated traders who built vast commercial networks. The same rivers they raided became highways of commerce, carrying furs, amber, honey, and slaves south and east, and bringing silver and silk back north. They founded and grew great trading towns. Far from being isolated savages, the Vikings were connected to a web of trade that stretched from the North American coast to the markets of the Middle East. Arab silver coins have been dug up by the thousands in Scandinavian soil, carried home from distant trading posts, and their culture was rich with law, poetry, and art. They had a system of governance built around assemblies of free men, called things, where disputes were settled and decisions made. One of which, in Iceland, is among the oldest continuous parliaments in the world. They had a written alphabet of runes. They created intricate, beautiful metalwork and wood carving. They composed a magnificent body of myth and poetry, the sagas and the Eddas, which preserved their gods, their heroes, and their history, and which remain some of the most powerful literature of the medieval world. This was not a simple people. This was a complex, capable, and deeply creative civilization that happened also to be one of the most feared military forces of its age. Their westward voyages, in particular, deserve a moment of genuine wonder. The North Atlantic is one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet, cold, fog-bound, and torn by storms. The Vikings crossed it in open boats, without compasses, without charts, without any certainty that there was anything on the other side at all. They read the flight of birds, the color of the water, the shape of distant clouds. Families loaded their entire lives, livestock, tools, children, into ships and sailed toward rumors. Iceland was settled this way by farmers seeking land beyond the reach of kings. Greenland was settled from Iceland, an even harder land at the very edge of the possible. And from Greenland, the boldest of them touched the coast of a continent whose existence Europe would not confirm for another 5 centuries. The settlement they left behind at the northern tip of Newfoundland lay forgotten under the grass for nearly 1,000 years, until archaeologists uncovered it in the 1960s and proved that the old sagas had been telling the truth all along. Daily life in the north, for the great majority, had nothing to do with raiding at all. Picture a longhouse on a fjord, a single great hall of timber and turf, smoke rising through a hole in the roof, an extended family and its animals sheltering together through the endless dark of winter. Around the fire, the long nights were filled with the telling of stories, the playing of board games, the working of wool and iron. Children learned the sagas of their ancestors by heart. Skalds, the poets of the north, composed intricate verses in praise of chieftains and gods, poetry so technically demanding that it stands among the most complex ever devised. In the spring came the planting, the fishing, the great gatherings where marriages were arranged, laws recited aloud from memory, and feuds settled, sometimes with silver, sometimes with duels. It was a hard, proud, structured world, rich in obligation and honor, and its people would not have recognized themselves in the horned helmet cartoons of later centuries. And it must be said plainly, the horned helmets never existed. No Viking warrior ever wore one. They were invented by costume designers 1,000 years later, and history has been trying to take them off ever since. Their ships deserve one last look, because everything else depended on them. A great longship could carry 60 warriors, yet it was light enough for its crew to haul overland between rivers on rollers of timber. Its overlapping planks flexed with the waves instead of fighting them, letting it survive seas that would break a stiffer hull. Under sail, it could outrun anything afloat. Under oars, it could move in dead calm, in darkness, in secrecy. The dragon heads mounted at the prow were not decoration. They were meant to terrify the spirits of the lands they approached, and they were taken down when a ship came home, so as not to frighten the friendly spirits of its own shore. When a great chieftain died, his people sometimes buried him in his ship, with weapons, treasures, and provisions for the voyage, because to the Norse, the ship was never merely a vehicle. It was the axis of their world, the thing that made every other part of their story possible. We know all this because some of those buried ships have been found, lifted whole out of the earth after 1,000 years, and they stand today in museums in Oslo, silent, elegant, and still unmistakably built for speed. So how did it end? Why did the terror of 3 centuries finally fade? The answer is not a single dramatic defeat, but a slow transformation. And it is here that the story becomes something quieter and more human. Over time, the raiders changed. The lands they had settled became home. The Norse colonists in England married into the local population, farmed the land, and within a few generations were simply English. In Normandy, the Northmen became the Normans, speaking French and building castles. And in Scandinavia itself, the scattered chiefdoms slowly consolidated into the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Christianity spread north, replacing the old gods, and with it came closer ties to the rest of Europe. The restless energy that had once driven longships onto foreign beaches was gradually absorbed into trade, statecraft, and settled life. Historians often mark the end of the Viking Age in the year 1066, when the last great Norse invasion of England was defeated just weeks before the Norman conquest. A conquest led, fittingly, by the descendants of Vikings themselves. The age of the raiders closed, in the end, not with their destruction, but with their transformation into the very nations and peoples of the Europe we know today. And that brings us back, at last, to a football stadium in the summer of 2026, and to thousands of people rowing invisible oars in the stands. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of it. A gesture that once heralded burning monasteries and stolen lives is now performed in joy by the peaceful descendants of both the raiders and the raided, in a tournament built entirely on the idea of nations competing without bloodshed. Some see in the celebration a proud connection to ancestry and endurance. Others see an uncomfortable romanticizing of a violent past, or simply a piece of viral theater that will fade as quickly as it rose. Both views hold a piece of the truth, and history itself offers no verdict. It only offers the record. But perhaps there is something quietly remarkable in the transformation itself. The rowing that once carried terror across the seas now carries nothing more dangerous than a football chant. The longships are museum pieces studied by school children in the very countries they once burned. The descendants of monks and raiders sit side by side in the same stadiums, cheering, arguing, and copying each other's celebrations. 12 centuries ago, the sight of oars rising and falling in unison meant that the world you knew might end before nightfall. Today it means only that somewhere a game has been won. Few images in history have traveled so far from where they began. And maybe that, more than the raids, more than the conquests, more than the sagas, is the most astonishing journey the Vikings ever made. There is one more thread worth following before we leave them, and that is what the Vikings left behind in us. Their words are still in our mouths, in English alone, everyday words like sky, window, knife, husband, egg, and law came from the speech of the Northmen, carried into the language by generations of settlement. The names of places across northern England and beyond still end in their suffixes. Thursday still carries the name of Thor. Their assemblies planted seeds of law and consultation that would grow in the countries they touched. Their sagas, written down in Iceland generations later, preserved not only their own history, but one of the great literatures of the medieval world. Stories of feud and honor, love and exile, so vivid and psychologically sharp that they still read like modern novels. The raiders took much, and that should never be forgotten. But it is also true that the world they helped shape is, in 1,000 quiet ways, still the world we live in. The end of the old faith deserves its own quiet word. The conversion of the North to Christianity did not happen in a day or by a single decree. It came haltingly, over generations, sometimes through genuine belief, sometimes through royal ambition, sometimes at the point of a sword. Kings saw in the new faith a way to bind their kingdoms together and to join the community of European rulers. Missionaries and traders carried it north. Returning Varangians brought it home from Constantinople. For a time, the two worlds overlapped strangely. Craftsmen carved the hammer of Thor and the cross of Christ in the same workshops, and some cautious souls wore both, hedging their bets between heavens. By the 11th century, the old gods were fading into story. Odin and Thor did not die. They simply moved from the temple into the tale, where they have lived ever since. In the sagas, in the Eddas, and eventually in the books and films of a world their worshippers could never have imagined. Even the age of raiding itself carried the seeds of its own ending. The Europe of the year 1000 was not the defenseless Europe of 793. Kingdoms had learned. Coastlines grew watchtowers and fortified bridges. Towns built walls. Kings built navies of their own. The easy plunder of an undefended monastery became the hard arithmetic of siege and pitched battle against prepared enemies. Raiding simply stopped paying. Meanwhile, the Northmen themselves had ever more to lose. Kingdoms, trade routes, farms, and faith bound them into the very European order their grandfathers had once torn at from the outside. The wolf, in the end, was not slain. It was domesticated by silver, by soil, and by time.